interesting conversations. And for me, and I'll highlight as well in my discussion is how there are different parts of this value chain and how there are different participants that need to work together in an ecosystem. On that note, I represent a company called IOT.nxt. We are an industrial Internet of Things company. So technically, we don't fly drones, we don't take pictures with drones, we just are in it for the information. We have drone technology as part of our solutions that we deploy for clients in places like mines and large agricultural projects, etc. So for us, it's really about how do we use drones as a platform to unlock difficult to get to data and then marry it together with other data streams. Because as useful as it is to purely have the drone information, it's also incredibly powerful when you plug it back into the systems that are already deployed inside these facilities. And while it loads up there, I'm just going to keep talking. So, you know, for example, there we go. Okay, fantastic. Thanks very much. So maybe just quickly, and we talked about how the last 4 years have had this massive change in technology, and it's getting more and more profound. So I won't go into the detail of this, but this is our friend Gordon Moore, who noticed the trend of basically the doubling of price performance every 18 months. And for me, what's interesting is this quote of his. In 1965, he had this quote. Bearing in mind, this was before the first digital watch existed. And he was saying integrated circuits will lead to wonders in home computers, terminals connected to central computers, remote controls, and personal communication equipment. So here's a guy in 1965 who could predict, before the first digital watch existed, that we'd have mobile phones and laptops and all these amazing things, right? Now, the reason why I'm saying this is to premise the fact that this is actually the nascency of this particular industry. And where it's going to go is going to have profound impact on industry. It's not just going to be a little change, it's going to be a profound impact, not just on how industries run and are being made efficient, but also on employment. But what are drones, right? We talk a lot around Amazon drones and those kinds of things. But there are a whole lot of other... Oh, fantastic, thank you very much. Lovely. But there are a whole lot of other types of drones, right? And quite frankly, from our perspective, whether they're flying, whether they're floating, whether they're dropping bombs, it doesn't really matter. It's about the fact that these are unmanned vehicles that get loaded with other things. They are, in fact, platforms, okay? So if you look at this guy, you take the weapons off it, and it's just a surveillance drone. Now put weapons on it, it's a weapon of war. These guys, they're using in the ports to go and take photos of the underneath of vessels to see whether there's damage to vessels. You even have very interesting sensing technology that can start to determine the thickness of the metal and where there's corrosion. So there's a whole lot of new interesting insights that we're able to gather through things like drones. I mean, you might have seen the one on the top left now. The most prolific drone program currently in the world is north of our border in Ethiopia, where they're delivering vaccines via drones. Because if you think about the interesting challenge that we have in Africa, we've got these massive, massive tracts of land and very poor infrastructure to get to these different locations. So in that particular instance, they found that they were having little motorbikes with refrigerated cooler boxes on the back of them, quickly stick some vaccines in it, give the guy a stopwatch and say, mate, in 24 hours, those things are worth nothing, go, right? And they found it was cheaper to deliver vaccines via fixed-wing drone than it was via a motorbike into the continent. And not just cheaper, but far more effective. So for me, what's very interesting is we think about these types of technologies, and we think that maybe they are more for the advanced economies. But here's a very good example of, because of our constraints, because of our frictions in the market, drones actually have taken off on the continent more than they have anywhere else in this particular instance, right? And then where we've done quite a lot of work is in this space over here, because we deployed on a lot of different mines, looking at optimization and reuse of very, very expensive resources. So the point that I want to make is, what is a drone? A drone is really a platform for doing things. So let's talk about it for a second. And Thanks so much for, what's the name of your company? Audio, the one before with the application for the trees? There we go. That's an aerobotics. We must talk because I think I've used your example. So this is a really important point for me, is that there are three different components to this market, right? And there's sometimes businesses that operate in components of that, or ones that have verticalized across the entire case. The case that you just mentioned now with one stack where there's one drone with a very specific piece of kit with their own software on top of it, you can get these to be very, very accurate and very powerful platforms. But equally, these can be broken up into separate business models that get brought together in an ecosystem. So here's just an example of a drone, and when I'm deciding on a problem statement for a client, the real questions are the performance of the drone. Right? Is what's the payload, how long can it fly for, et cetera, et cetera. And these are the key requirements. And ultimately, those requirements come from which devices you're going to place on them. So for example, that's a multispectral camera, and you saw the guys were talking about looking at things like chloroform in leaves. And as soon as I now put that multispectral camera onto this drone, I now go and fly a field, and as per the example earlier, I can now start using purchase order factoring to decide which fruit is going to come from which trees. This is just one single example of a bringing together of these different components. But the reality is there can be multiple different examples. And I've had the luxury of going across to some interesting places in Tel Aviv and seeing some of the most fantastic technologies and how these things are going to be put on drones. I'll give you an example. I was there end of last year, and probably about the size of this thing, just about bigger than a USB, is a handheld electron microscope. But I can go up to a wall, I can scan the wall, and it tells me what mineral content is in there. I'll be able to scan a stockpile of coal, and it'll tell me the calorific value. Okay? Now if we start thinking about that type of sensing capability, and the fact that we can deploy that onto any drone, and now I can actually have a drone flying around doing far more complex tasks than I could ever have imagined. And it might start with just looking at doing aerial supervision and looking at the size of stockpiles, etc. But as the technology continues to get more advanced, driven by things like Moore's Law, we're going to find increasing uses for these drones, where we're going to put increasingly sophisticated pieces of kit on them and be able to achieve some really, really fantastic things. And to give you an example, I want to show you a very short video. Now, this is actually from 2010, which kind of gives you the example of how this is actually a really long time ago. This research and was funded by the Gates Foundation. I don't know if any of you have seen this. This is a laser that is able to pick up the wing beat frequency of a mosquito and zap it. Right? So you can think about this. I mean, that's quite amazing, right? And sorry, not all that many women in the audience, so maybe I can say this, is that obviously, as we know, the female mosquitoes are the evil ones, right? They're the ones that need the blood meal and give you all the malaria. So very, very clever. This laser is able to pick up the wing beat frequency difference between a male and a female mosquito. So it only zaps the females, right? Now, let's think about this from a drone application perspective. So we're talking about all these drones that are flying around and spraying pesticide. Now, that's great, but why don't I just have a drone flying around with a laser on it that can pick up the wing beat frequency of the aphids that are chowing my whatever it is, and actually zap them as I fly up and down the apple orchard? Why would I ever need pesticide ever again? That would be the death of an entire sector. Think about the amount of pollution that goes into the rivers. Think about the whole industry that is pesticides. What happens if I can go and scale this thing to the point that it's cost effective enough? And by the way, they use that laser from a laser printer to give you a context of how easy it is to do this kind of stuff. So for me, what's important is we mustn't just get stuck on the drone, or just get stuck on the piece of the equipment that we load onto the drone. Also, at that end part is what is the business model that lies on top of this thing. So, IOT.nxt loves this technology, not because we will ever do it ourselves, but we partner with guys to get information that we could never have got before. And I'll give you some mining examples. But what we do as IOT.nxt is we have an interoperability layer that lives on top of edge devices. Okay? So I can, for example, take the data that's coming off the drone scan, and I can then go and integrate into the the sprinkler system and articulate to a particular tree where it needs the water the most. Or on a mining example where we've made good use to drone information is we've connected into the conveyor belts on the one side of a coal stockpile, or actually the trucks on the input side, on the conveyors on the outside. And then what we're able to do is we're able to see the volume of coal on the conveyor belt, the volume going out the other side, and in real time have the drones flying and doing stockpile analysis. So we're able to get a whole mass flow of coal through a mining plant every hour, whereas before it was happening every 2 weeks. So really that's why we're interested in this particular domain, is there's data that can be gathered from a drone that cannot be gathered in any other way. And really that's what we're interested in, right? So let's look at a few of these different examples. So inspections, this is quite clear. I mean, I think we've spoken a lot around this today. And for me, it's not just about saying, I now have a drone taking off, it flies around and comes back. I now need to go and take this image and have a specialist review the image. It's even getting to a point now where I can get interesting machine learning technologies, machine vision capabilities to be able to recognize what's happening in these images and give me real-time input. But I'll give you an example. So on the stockpile scanning over here, and we did this for one of the large coal mines in South Africa, very, very large piece of land, and the surveyors would have to walk something like 11 kilometers in the course of the day to go and do the assessment of each one of these stockpiles. And they get to the stockpile and they climb up to the top of it, and these are not cheap guys, and they go and do this, and then a few days later I have an answer, right? We started going and getting the drone footage taken every hour, and then that same quantity surveyor, one instead of 5 of them, would sit and review the images and come up with exactly the same accuracy of solution in literally 1/20th of the time. The question that you start asking yourself is, does that mean that you have to fire all your quantity surveyors? What we found very interesting is they actually started reusing those quantity surveyors in different ways. So they said, okay, instead of going and climbing up and down stockpiles, why don't you go and make sure that the measurements on the drill holes on the block are more accurate? Because actually that affects the fragmentation of my coal, and that adds value to my solution. So they didn't lose any jobs, right? And then what happened? We ran this as a proof of concept. End of the proof of concept, stopped the program. There was basically a riot of the surveyors that said, you will bring that drone technology back or we are going on strike. A very different perspective to what we normally think of when it comes to digitization and exponential technologies. So for me, it's a question about how do we repurpose human intelligence to add value to the value-adding things and start to automate and leverage the efficiencies of platforms like drones. And make no mistake, the technologies that we can put onto these drones are going to get more and more and more advanced. And the people in this room, you guys are actually very fortunate because you've come into an industry in its nascency. And this industry is going to really, really change the game. So very interesting to be part of this and also to talk to you about this today. One of the interesting ones is fire breaks. Have you seen this? They've got a drone flying around that shoots fireballs. And actually shoots fireballs to set the fire breaks and actually puts the fire out. So as it sits, it lights the grass, does the fire break, and then puts it out. Automated on a geofence. It runs around and does fire breaks around specific locations. This is a very interesting one. Putting things like thermal cameras onto a drone. So you've heard of combustion, autonomous combustion of coal that's sitting inside a stockpile. Not only is that incredibly dangerous, but they lose a lot of value as well. Just by flying around with a thermal camera, you're now able to see if there's an event like this happening. Similarly, you can fly over heavy equipment and you start picking up locations where there's additional heat, which means that there's additional friction, which means you might need to do preventative maintenance. Lots of interesting things you can pick up from these views. And yeah, I think that's enough for me. Thanks, everyone.